Welcome, everybody. My name's David Wood, and it's my pleasure to chair London Futurists. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to today's presenter. That's Elise Bohan, who is a senior research scholar at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. I first came across Elise in references to a PhD thesis she had written a few years back, which was described as the first full-length comprehensive history of transhumanism. I've done my own research into the history of transhumanism over the years. Indeed, I take history very seriously. I stand by the saying that if you want to practice better foresight, you need to practice better hindsight. You need to understand history's trends and see the patterns, and then be prepared to transcend some of these trends and patterns, but not out of ignorance, but out of true appreciation of what's happening. So when I read a copy of the thesis, and by the way, you can find it fairly easily online as a PDF, I was inspired to see many half ideas of my own joined together into a very thorough and convincing chronicle, not just of the history of transhumanism, but of the prehistory of transhumanism. Lots of people who spoke in centuries past about transhumanist themes without using that word. Then I found that Elise was working on a new book, which has just been published a few days ago, I think 6 days ago. It is now available in all good bookshops, as they say. And the title of the book includes Future Superhuman and Transhuman Century, and these words might sound a bit scary, superhuman and transhuman, but I have to say the book itself is full of human spirit. It's a very human book with a lot of attention to the issues that occupy, dare I say it, real people's attention, not just a few techno geeks. So there is lots of analysis there about all aspects of the human experience. So I was very inspired when I read it, and I was pleased, therefore, that Elise has agreed to share some thoughts about it today. So she'll speak for a while to start off with, and then we'll move into the Q&A. Elise, welcome to London Futurists. Over to you.
Thanks, David, and thank you so much for having me here today. I think the opening question for you guys in the audience surely has to be, why write another book about transhumanism? Surely I don't plan to best Bostrom's superintelligence, Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, or even Ed Regis's Great Mumbo Chicken and the Transhuman Condition, which is undeniably a classic. So what am I trying to do here, and why? Well, the first aim, I think, for a book of 2022 is to fight future shock. I really want to provide a broad readership, and particularly young people, with an honest, but of course provisional map of what it really means to be human in the 21st century. And I think that entails telling people some things that might be at times hard to hear. So to that end, my second aim is to make it clear that transhumanist upheavals are happening in our world, and more are going to happen in the future, whether we like it or not. A third goal is to signal boost the meme that this is a make or break century for humanity. We're living in a transition time that will ultimately lead us to either post-humanity or to extinction. And the final goal is to deliver the unpleasant truth that our ape brains are not purpose-built to handle a complex, technologically mature global civilization like the one we find ourselves in today. That means without an upgrade to something more than human, we're not going to make it far into the future. Now that is a lot for most people to take in. I don't think it's going to shatter the worldviews of many of you on this call today, but nevertheless, it's important to say that this is an unusual book, or at least I think it is, because it breaks almost all of the rules of what modern nonfiction books are told they're supposed to be. For starters, publishers like books to focus really tightly on one big idea. You can't talk about too many different things and link them all together, otherwise people will stop paying attention. So my first sin is that I do have multiple core ideas in this book. It's a transhuman era and a make or break century. Those two alone are enormous ideas and very, very hard to convince people of at scale. We don't care nearly enough about existential risks. And if we keep tottering around with unaugmented ape brains, we won't survive much past the 21st century. So Future Superhuman is a super big picture book, and it weaves stories across multiple timescales, from the big picture existential stuff or the existential risk stuff in the first half, where I also explain why we are living in a transhuman era, down to the human story in the second half, where we really bring it back down to earth and talk about many of the things that we really care most about in our everyday lives. So family, work, health, sex, dating, procreation, and purpose. The reason my book combines the big picture and the human story is because that's how they come packaged in real life. We can better understand the things we care most about in life when we frame them in the bigger context of a world in transition. It's not as if social complexity, population growth, and rapid technological development affect just one or two facets of our life. They affect them all, and not discreetly. Changes to your work life, earning potential, and social status can affect your sex life, mental health, and reproductive future. When some of those changes happen at scale, we can see things like changes in fertility rates, which then affect social norms, economic growth, social stability, and how amenable we are to automation, or indeed how imperative it is that our societies and civilizations come to rely on it. So when we make some of those links clearer, as I do in Future Superhuman, then the far-out idea that we're living in a transhuman era starts to feel more real and believable to those who are skeptics, or at least that's my hope. So my starting assumption about most readers is that getting them to care and to really engage with the big opportunities and the major X risks that transhumanists like us care about and routinely talk about, that job is really, really hard. Most people, I think, care most about themselves, and they're most comfortable and happiest, it seems, thinking about what's right in front of them. Family, their job, their chances of a promotion, the tasty dinner that they're going to have in a few hours' time, and how many likes they got on Instagram today. We are status-seeking animals. We're opportunists, and we're fundamentally driven to optimize for survival and reproduction. Humans, as we know, are also short-termists, built to care about kin-ordered tribes of less than 100 people and futures spanning maybe a few decades. So with that in mind, my goal was to tap into those dominant human concerns, the small stuff that we'd rather think about in lieu of climate change, AI, and nuclear war, and show readers how thinking like a transhumanist can help them prepare for life in a world that feels like it's changing really fast. That part, people seem to get, or at least they're getting it much more than they did 10 years ago. Lots of the old life scripts feel like they're crumbling, and that's hitting millennials and Gen Zers especially hard, or at least I argue that it is in the book, particularly in the chapter called A Generation of Kidults, but also in the chapters on work, sex, dating, gender, and having babies. I know most of you guys will have heard plenty about existential risks. You're not the folks that I need to convince that we're living in a transhuman era. And nor do I really need to explain Moore's law and exponential growth and transhumanism 101. I should flag, though, that this is an optimistic book and there's heaps on the upsides of technology. But you guys hear about that all the time and you know that story. So I'm going to give a bit more weight to the grittier side of things today that we cover in the human story. To give you a really broad idea of what the human story in the book is about, where it's really about connecting the nodes between topical issues of the day and showing how they're part of this bigger transition. We start with AI, first and foremost. AI is a general purpose technology, something that's getting smarter, more powerful, and more pervasive at a phenomenal rate. That story is not new. One of the expected consequences that we hear a lot about and many books have been published on is that will allow us to generate more goods and services using less human labor. Another consequence is that this could massively accelerate the pace of drug discovery and drive increases in human lifespans and health spans. How far exactly, we're not sure, but let's imagine a world where we live longer, healthier lives and we're concurrently no longer tethered by necessity to work a 9 to 5. Already, we're in a very different landscape there. We've got better AI at this point, remember, general purpose technology, so it's not just making one thing smarter and faster and better. So many of the applications of AI, things like natural language processing, means that we'll have a lot of social interfacing with the AIs in this world. That means we can be building friends, like friendships, and making romantic connections with non-human persons. The pull towards AI friends and lovers may be further fueled if conventional signifiers of human male status in particular, so a good job, access to resources, and future earning potential, become harder for many men to come by in a world of heavy automation. I know there's a lot of assumptions underpinning these connections, but there's lots of ways we can slice and dice this. We're just trying to show how some of those connections could play out. So let's throw VR porn and sex bots into the mix, both of which already exist. And you're messing with the sex ratios in the human dating pool, throwing the old life scripts even more off kilter. Some of these changes, I fear, will be terribly disruptive. But the problems and solutions are intertwined, and getting rid of the technology is not an option. As it becomes harder for humans to pair up with each other, we will need some of our sources of social connection to come from AI, particularly as well in a world of aging populations. We're already struggling to sustain aged care, and the burden of that is going to continue to grow across the globe. With that in mind, we're also barreling towards a demographic crunch with falling fertility rates across the world. My bet is that the rise of AI will accelerate the trajectory of human depopulation, which is something that absolutely terrifies most people. And I have my fears about how some of the ways that could play out as well. I think that basically leaves us with no choice, ironically, but to double down on a post-human future, because we won't be able to sustain economic growth without more collective intelligence. If we no longer make enough human people to generate wealth, we will need to give rise to mind children, more machines, more AI. And that is how we end up with a final chapter in this book called The End of Having Babies, which is a particularly confronting one, but I think nevertheless a very important and thought-provoking one. There's lots of topical stuff in the mix, including a discussion of the sudden rise in transgenderism in the modern world and its links to our species' broader transhuman transition. I think we really need to prime our minds for these kinds of possibilities. Of course, when it comes to the specifics, we know the future will be stranger than any of us imagine. The fantastical will seem obvious in retrospect. Magical technologies will appear as banal as the smartphone supercomputer that you carry in your pocket today. And many of perhaps the most transformative technologies might actually be quite banal. They won't be the flying cars and the whiz-bang gadgets. They'll be something that's so seamlessly integrated into our landscapes that we think very little of them. What we know is that the world is changing faster than we can adapt already. And that's making for some hard and confusing times. I think that that's a really good starting point for prognostication. In all likelihood, many of us in the short term are going to feel, as James Hughes once put it, steamrolled by the future. Even many people who are wealthy and better insulated from hard economic shocks, they can still struggle to find partners and build healthy, loving relationships. They can struggle with body image and self-esteem in the age of social media and ceaseless social comparison on a global scale. They can feel desperately lonely, confused, overworked, and spend hours every day furiously scrolling through social media, tapping eagerly to signal at the things that they like, and tapping furiously and aggressively to decry the things they hate. They can be cancelled and ostracized with a few clicks of a few buttons. They could have invested decades of their lives and the deepest parts of their souls in endeavors that become fringe or obsolete overnight. Who are they then? What matters? What's the point of them now? And how do any of us remain stable, connected, and afloat in such a world? This is, I believe, a time of rug pulls for us all. And this is something I am adamant we must be honest about. As a transhumanist, I'm incredibly hopeful and optimistic about the future of humanity and of intelligent life. But we cannot afford to dismiss the valid concerns of millions of our fellow humans when they state that these transition times feel scary, uncomfortable, and at times downright hopeless or dehumanizing. I'm not saying we should base all our policy decisions on the intuitive yuck factor. We definitely shouldn't. But when people ask, what does this big change or this new technology mean for me? There are times where we need to stop and say, well, there's great promise attached to this technology, but it could make your job obsolete and transform society in ways that are really discombobulating, some of which might make your life worse. If all we've got is utopian hand-waving, people will rightly roll their eyes, write us off as cranks, and go back to the concrete business of everyday living. The tragedy of that outcome is that they'll remain unprepared for how their everyday lives might change rapidly and radically. And all because we chose hype-mongering instead of painting a credible picture about how life could unfold in a transhuman era, with reference to the stuff that the human beings who are alive today actually care about. I expect that many people's livelihoods are going to crumble as automation ramps up in the short term. I think it's going to be hard for many to upskill, reskill, and pivot into a comfortable existence. This transition is likely to have devastating effects on the dating and mating prospects of many young people. In all likelihood, sane and humane welfare policies will lag far behind the social need for them. I wager that millions of humans will falter and suffer before we get our act together and start attending to the damage. Many kids will grow up with the wrong kind of socialization and education for the world they'll find themselves in as adults. The epidemic of mental health problems in our society is surely going to get worse before it gets better. And these transitional concerns are precisely why I don't want to live in a world where social cohesion is dependent on us pulling the wool over our eyes and routinely lying to ourselves and each other about what's coming or what's possible. I don't want to endorse a social norm where politicians waffle on about job creation and making kids future ready, without addressing profound conundrums, like what people with average and below average IQs are realistically going to do and how they'll be remunerated in an ever more winner-takes-all knowledge economy. What do slogans like "No Child Left Behind" actually mean in concrete policy terms? 20th century average isn't going to cut it for long in the 21st century. And the middle class is already feeling incredible status anxiety over this fact. This is one of the most brutal truths of our time, and one of the most crucial things we can foreground in modern policy discussions. But it requires acknowledging something that we're determined not to see, and a lie that we aggressively enforce. Yet the truth is simple. All humans were not created equal. That truth should unleash in us a wellspring of empathy and a proactive desire to solve for the hardships it implies. It's very hard to solve a problem, though, if you can't see it and you don't believe that it's real. If we truly want to devise policies that help create a bright, sustainable, and humane future for as many people as possible, I believe we need to stop pretending that unpalatable prospects are impossible, and we need to prepare for them. Sometimes I think that hope is the enemy of truth. I've learned one profound lesson as an adult member of the human race, and that's that most people seem to have a very low tolerance for the truth. We all want to hear that humanity will prevail, that we'll survive and thrive for as long as is possible, and that the better angels of our nature will triumph over the forces of evil and darkness. What I think is more likely is that something better than humanity will unfurl from human intelligence and supersede it. I also think a merger of humans with technology, or the creation of superhuman successors, is imperative if any of the things we care about in this world, consciousness, experience, knowledge, discovery, love, and intelligence, are to survive. To quote directly from the book, Oscar Wilde's apocryphal last words were, "Either this wallpaper goes or I do." In the transhuman era, either our ape brains go to be replaced by something smarter, or we will fail to solve the growing number of global sustainability challenges we face. We will continue to live in a world of profound discord, environmental degradation, and geopolitical tension. Nuclear war, asteroids, and pandemics will remain a constant threat, along with the emerging dangers posed by climate change, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and nanotechnology. Meanwhile, individuals will continue to live as the collateral damage of larger sets of cultural, environmental, and genetic circumstances that they're powerless to control. We're currently involved in a high-stakes juggling act, and we're mucking about as if it were a dress rehearsal. I'm afraid the performance is now, and we only have one shot to get it right. To do that, we'll need help from minds that are less tribal, myopic, and self-interested than our own. Our most crucial task in the 21st century is to invent them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elise. Absolutely packed full of ideas. So much to pick up. Let's pick up on the ape brain question. Our ape brains are not enough. I think most people will accept there are problems with our mental attitudes, our myopia, as you described it, our self-centeredness. But there's a lot of people very worried about any attempts to mess with our brains. The fear that if we do try and change our brains, we will cause worse problems than we have already. So what do you have in mind by actually envisioning better brains than our ape brains? How are we going to get there, and how are we going to avoid unwanted side effects along that route?
Well, for starters, I think that's a really well-founded fear and a really important thing to be concerned about. In terms of pathways to post-humanity or human augmentation, we know that there's multiple contenders that transhumanists are interested in. So obviously we can have the sort of Neuralink route of machine-brain interfaces. The eventual aspiration might be something like mind uploading. But I think the scenario that I find most plausible there, to be honest, I don't find mind uploading particularly plausible, even if it's theoretically possible, is that we'll essentially be leapfrogged by digital intelligence, that AI will not be instantiated in human biology in a particularly profound way, that it will go on to evolve as machine intelligence and be enmeshed in the systems that govern our world and impact the biosphere, and that intelligence will at some point take off and hit an intelligence explosion kind of inflection. And in that scenario, you have less worries about, well, what exactly does that do to the human machine in terms of interfering with long evolved biological processes? But I don't want to fully dodge that question either, because I think, I talk about the transition times in the book, and the fact that before we get strong AI, before we get to a world where that takeoff occurs, if indeed it does, there are all sorts of ways in which we would still be augmenting human biology, leaping way ahead of spectacles and pacemakers, to be tinkering more on the genetic and molecular level. And there, I have to say, I am kind of concerned. I find it incredibly exciting. I think we need to, like all transhumanists, I think we would be crazy not to explore these possibilities to the full. We'd be crazy to impose a moratorium on genetic engineering, for example. We know that even if many countries do that, not all will, and the cat will be out of the bag at some point. So it's much better to do it out in the open and to endeavor to be as ethical as possible. But we have the enduring conundrum, which is the same problem we have in AI safety, which is, of course, that the incentives pushing for aggressive R&D and commercialization of biotechnology far outflank the incentives to take it slowly, build them safely, and to agree on protocols that would be in the best interests of everybody. To even know what protocols that are in the best interest of everybody are is another challenge in itself. So I think we could go down this rabbit hole for a very, very long time. But yeah, to cycle back, I kind of second David implicitly in that question, that it's a really serious concern. We should take it seriously.
Thanks. And I see there are a few questions arriving now from the audience. I will encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A window. Ideally reasonably short. If you write a reasonably short question, more people are likely to read it and upvote it. And we will also look from time to time in the chat window for general comments, and even on YouTube, where I see there's a few comments as well. Let me take a question from Valentin Chernoskov, who asks, who should decide the questions of which way forward for humanity? Bearing in mind that most people, most democratic voters, they don't have the cognitive abilities to understand the implications of proposed policies. So do you envision these decisions to be taken by governments, by private companies, or indeed by general public? Or how are we going to resolve these different viewpoints?
Well, I think many of the big changes that are coming won't be decisions at all. They won't even be fully conscious. I think we've enmeshed ourselves in such technologically advanced civilizations in which we're so symbiotic and codependent on the machines that we rely on to sustain the global economy, that we're almost kind of locked in a feedback loop of coevolution with technology. Now, that doesn't go as far as to say that every possible instantiation of advanced technology becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's no dialing anything back. There's no making any decisions at all. That's definitely not the case. But in terms of who gets to decide, it's a phenomenally complex question. Again, a very, very important question. And I kind of, to generalize, I do sort of sympathize with where a lot of the transhumanist community seems to have sort of merged over time, which is towards a sort of civil libertarian position on some of this. So rather than being extremely anarcho-capitalist, extremely like let the market decide, I think we obviously do need some government involvement here, particularly when it comes to how, let's say, genetic technologies will be integrated into modern healthcare, as one example. But we're not even going to come close to even within a single nation state reaching a solid consensus on even subsets of big issues. Even let's just take AI, and then AI as applied to healthcare, AI as applied to self-driving car technology. It's a minefield, and I think the fact that it's such a minefield, and it's only going to get more so, reinforces the argument that I make in the book, which is that this is really getting beyond us very quickly. Our ape brains cannot coordinate on this. We don't have a hive mind dynamic in which we can interface really seamlessly and rapidly and kind of telepathically understand each other and empathize. And we can't also, with the ape brains that we have, as David alluded to, bring everybody up to a similar baseline level where it's just possible for a passable level of understanding of any of this. So my hope is that we will see at least some more politicians with at least rudimentary understanding of some of this stuff. I don't expect that to scale particularly far, and I expect a lot of serious missteps to be made, both from the big tech world and in the political domain. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Well, indeed tricky, but as you say, important. So let's continue along this line of thinking. A question by Andreas Temos Eunice. I'm sorry, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce your surname, Andreas. But you have a great question. Whilst I think we all agree that the questions we are pondering here are of crucial importance, many politicians and policymakers treat transhumanism as a joke or science fiction. So how can we change that? How do we make more policymakers take these matters more seriously?
I love this question. Thank you so much for it. And I've thought about this a great deal. I vacillate on this question quite a bit. I'm almost in two camps simultaneously, which is tricky. Because you've got the question of, do we start to become more malleable in our identity? Do we start to massage the truth or even lie about intentions in order to try and make the medicine of transhumanism go down with that spoonful of sugar? Do we try and not just do what I'm doing in Future Superhuman, which was genuinely show that this is going to affect everybody? Because I do it in a way that's confronting and in a way that a lot of people are going to hate. Do we start dialing back on our core concerns in order to garner more favor with mainstream politics, mainstream media, etc.? Or do we accept that perhaps transhumanism forever remains the untenable mean? And I think that's where I'm sitting more often than not nowadays. As much as I find the transhumanist worldview profound and important and perplexed at how under-recognized it is, I have the sense that because of the way most transhumanists present, and by that I mean, I think most of us are more similar to each other than we would to in personality traits than we would be to random members of the human population. And that's no accident. Transhumanism attracts a certain minority subset of the human population, and I suspect that will always be true. Now, there is certainly significant diversity in the transhumanist movement, but it does skew male, rationalist, on the spectrum, people who tend to be high in openness to experience, people who are more concerned with the big picture than everyday minutiae. And, you know, this is not typical of the average human personality structure or mindset. And we could make a conscious choice to say, right, I'm going to abandon rationalist speak and transhumanist jargon and try and funnel this into a package that will resonate with the average person. But I think the ideas themselves don't allow for that packaging. They don't fit into that package, and they probably never will. So I think the reality is that we're going to continue to live in a world that's profoundly influenced by transhumanist agendas. I think transhumanism is absolutely saturated in the big tech world, whether people wear that label or not. And I suspect the average person, and indeed the average politician, is going to remain relatively unaware of that fact for a frighteningly long time. And I churn over that and angst over that, and I'm torn between thinking maybe that's a good thing and worrying that that's not a good thing. I do err on the side of thinking that it is always better to know the truth, and I wish we could communicate the significance of transhumanist ideas and technologies at a larger scale. But I do suspect that the transhumanist meme is going to struggle and continue to fly under the radar for a long time.
There are some transhumanists who shy away from that word completely, and they advocate not telling people about humanity plus. They say, if you want to talk about H plus, let it be health plus, more health, or happiness plus, more happiness, because you will frighten people by talking about the word transhumanism is frightening, and even the notion of evolving beyond our human nature is frightening. So there are some people who take this a spoonful of sugar, perhaps, or maybe it's not even that, because they're not even passing through an explicit transhumanist message. So do you think people who are interested in this field should continue to want to fly under the radar, or is there a case for there being an ism, an explicit ism, a narrative that people can suddenly orient their lives around in a way that isn't possible when we don't make this an explicit topic of the conversation?
I would like to live in a world where both of those things exist. I would be very, very sad to see the disappearance of the ism and the disappearance of those who want to create a narrative that's coherent, that has a history, that gives those who are looking for it a bigger picture sense of how lots of different things in our world fit together, and how there is this current of change that is part of a larger evolutionary sequence. I think that is a really important story to maintain, to have advocates for, and to have at least some of us who are not afraid of the consequences of that. Because I think, you know, if you're the biogerontology space, health plus space is a really good example of this. You know, until the last, let's say, 10 years, that was anything to do with radical life extension or life extension at all was a big no-no, a career-ending thing. Many molecular biologists would, have grand ambitions, but pretend not to in order to continue to survive in their careers. And I think that's, in one sense, sad, but in another sense, completely understandable. And I think there is value to those who find themselves in that bind to advocate on a more modest level, not merely because it may be expedient for them or their career, but also because transhumanism is a grand, and indeed you might say at times grandiose, ideology and worldview. It can lapse into that. And actually plugging away on single concrete goals that are part of a transhumanist ethos, I think it's essential that we also have that. So if somebody dedicated their entire career to just health span extension and making human beings healthier, that would be a profound win for transhumanists and for the species. So I'd love to see both of those things coexisting.
Let's come back to your thoughts on the coming generation, or the kidults, as you call them. Historians have said every generation was fearful of the one that was coming next. Every generation says that children are growing up with no respect for their elders, without an appreciation of long-standing values. The generation that my son is part of, he's now in his early 30s, many people feared that they were going to ruin their lives playing video games. Or arguably, in fact, many of the video games taught people social skills of a sort because they're played online in groups, and improved hand-eye coordination and problem-solving skills. So what's your answer to the objection? Well, this is nothing new. This is just each generation having a rosy tinted view of the past and overly fearful view of the future.
Well, I think we'd be remiss to not acknowledge that that may well be true. History hasn't borne this out yet, and we do actually need to wait and see what happens. But at the same time, I think there are good indicators that things are things are on an unusual trajectory. So catastrophizing merely that young people are on social media a lot, that they're spending, they're having less face time with their peers, they're socializing more online. Catastrophizing merely from that'll be the equivalent of television rotting your eyes or video games making you antisocial. That's not enough to base that argument on. But when we've got concurrent trends, things like declining marriage and fertility rates, delayed age of first marriage in many countries across the world, more people remaining single in perpetuity, the nuclear family now about to be picked in many countries as the dominant living arrangement for adults. Then you've got a clue, along with the rising rates of mental illness and the soaring prescriptions for antidepressants across the world, that people do not feel the same sense of connectedness, community, and ease of access to the old life scripts as they once did. Now, it doesn't follow that it's a catastrophe, that we can't attain all of the old life scripts, but it does appear that there are teething problems in the transition, that in spite of our abundance of information riches and entertainment and knowledge, and all the things that modern technology has provided, there's this mismatch going on between the ape brain and the modern future that's emerging. And while we're locked inside the ape brain that still just wants to, is primed for a life of maybe like 40 years, still just wants to have sex and have babies and hang out with their kin-ordered tribes and know everybody in their world and, pick a team and barrack for the team and wag their fists at the bad guys, when we no longer have the environment for those brains. And I think there's very good reason to think that that's causing significant distress for the individuals, but particularly those who are in the peak reproductive prime of their lives. Yeah, that's my rejoinder there.
Let's take one of the top-rated questions by Tony Zarneski, who asks about the positive vision in your book, rather than the long, accurate, penetrating analysis of the problems of today's society. He asks, how do you define this superhuman? To what extent will we be digital beings rather than biological beings? Do you have a clear view, or is it just a direction of travel that you can talk with some confidence about?
I don't have a particularly clear view, to be honest. I think there's, again, so many directions that post-humanity could go in, some of them extremely negative. But my bet is that things will overall go well. What the post-human, the augmented human, the stuff we can look forward to looks like. I set this up in the introduction to the book, and I give the slightly deflating explanation that I do think that once we're into the realm of significant enhancement, particularly major intelligence augmentation or unleashing strong AI into the world, we're kind of hitting an event horizon of prediction. Exactly what it feels like, the fleshy sensory experience of being radically augmented, writers have tried and tried and tried to characterize this, and they do it badly. Usually it's like, it tends to be rather kitsch, quaint examples that are so anthropocentric and so tethered to stuff that we know how to conceptualize. And my vision is that basically it's going to be something we can't imagine, which doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I think in broad strokes, we can imagine. My expectation is, when people talk about seed AI and going on to generate aligned AI, one of the things we wonder about is how much we can tether something that is super intelligent to the goals and incentive structures and values of a human being. Would it have emotions? Would it care about the stuff that we care about? And I'm skeptical that we can tether that. My best guess is that something that is orders of magnitude smarter than us is going to out-evolve human values and concerns. And my hope, to bring it back around to optimism, is that with that amount of intelligence going on, the ability to explore the mysteries of consciousness and the universe, to answer unsolved questions, to do so many of the things that make our spines tingle and our minds buzz with excitement. I suspect that in addition to merely harvesting resources and surviving and thriving, a super intelligent AI is going to find a lot of incredible stuff out, stuff that would blow our minds, make us cry at the beauty and the awe of it. And whether or not they feel human emotions as we do, I suspect that it's certainly possible that they will have a range of enviable, incredible emotions or lived experiences that we don't have words or names for, maybe things that transcend emotions as we know them. And I find that an incredibly optimistic, albeit scarily opaque vision, because of the incredible potential encoded in the future of intelligence.
If we're talking about truly profound experiences, many people will say that some of their most profound experiences were in connection with their children. It was the birth of their babies, it was seeing their children graduate, or various struggles in their lives and how they were solved. So in the world that you envision, are there really no human babies anymore?
To be clear, I envisage that as one of many possibilities. And I signal boost it because it's the one that we are so afraid to let our minds wander to, because it's very interesting to me. The last chapter of my book is called The End of Having Babies. And in many ways, there's a strongly feminist bent to it, where I talk about pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding as the last Achilles heels of feminism. I found that this chapter in particular has mostly been confronting for male readers, to my great surprise. And in particular, men who either have children of their own or grandchildren, or men who are aspiring very soon to become fathers. And I think what's curious to me about this, particularly from transhumanist respondents, is that in every other aspect of life, we can tinker here, we can augment, we can enhance. So it doesn't matter if it was human. It doesn't matter if, the appeal to nature, the state of nature stuff, where, the naturalistic fallacy, we're usually eye rolling at that and going, well, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's right or optimal or desirable. But this seems to be the one sacred cow that is a bridge too far for a lot of people. And I totally understand that. To be really clear, I'm not saying, hey, children are awful. If you have them, that's silly. You shouldn't do that. And that there's no beauty or wonder or majesty to be derived from those experiences. I really do believe that if this is not a transhuman era, if I'm wrong, and very little is different between today and 2100, then probably the smartest thing most people could do, or the thing that they will derive most meaning from in their life, is to have children. Not everybody, but there are not many exceptions to that rule. But I think we are in a transhuman era, and the reason I can plausibly see fertility rates approaching zero this century without stemming from or engendering a societal collapse is because once we have a saturation of incredibly intelligent AI, virtual and augmented reality, we're overlaying this on the already massively downwards trend of pair bonding, procreation, stable marriages, and not only that, but social investment in the so-called real world. Young people in particular are already living part of their lives very deeply online. They are curating their digital identities more assiduously than they are investing in their actual social lives and in reality. They're hybrid creatures already. That trend doesn't have to hold, but if the technology keeps going, I can't see any real plausible possibility of reversing that. And the fact that that correlates or goes along with this seeming epidemic of mental health issues, I really think that a lot of young people are going to be suspended in perpetual kidulthood. And the generation that follows Gen Z in particular, that grows up fully online, born to parents who in many cases are only going to have the one child. So there's less family, there's less community, there's less precedent for the family unit than ever. I think it's plausibly going to crumble. And then you add universal basic income into the mix if we're talking about a post-work society scenario, and then the allure of a world where you can just be so deeply enmeshed in virtual landscapes. It will trump the trade-off, I think, of the incredible sacrifices that are involved and the incredible costs involved in having children, that they've never cost us so much in terms of both money, but also time and emotional investment and the societal expectations that we place on parents today. Young people are already voting on this by having fewer and fewer children and many more opting out of parenthood altogether. So I think the trend is a pretty profound one, but we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out.
There are 14 great questions in the Q&A, which I promise, audience, I will turn to in a minute. But I'd like just to stick with this theme a little bit more because I feel it is quite a profound theme and one that the transhumanist community maybe doesn't explore as much as we should. So I remember a couple of years ago, BC, before COVID, when London Futurists used to meet in the real world, we had a male speaker on technology. He was a bit skeptical about transhumanism, and he threw out a remark that the worst possible technology was synthetic wombs. He said, "This is just a fantasy. What a terrible thing." And in the pub later, he got attacked basically by 3, as it turns out, women who were quite upset by his remarks. And they all said, well, they would be very interested in exploring the possibilities of the synthetic womb technology. Not expecting it would be available anytime soon, but they thought it's something that had a real means, a real value. So do you think that some of your apprehensions that you point out, people don't want to take lots of time off from their career or from their other life to bear a child inside their bodies, that this would disappear if we took advantage of technology envisioned long ago by J.B.S. Haldane and Aldous Huxley, but we do it, of course, differently? Do you think this would change the argument and there might be more human babies after all?
No, I don't think so. I do write about ectogenesis and artificial wombs in the book, in large part because I just think it's such a fascinating prospect. And obviously we do know that there are precursor technologies in existence where they're partially gestating lambs and mice in artificial wombs with profound success for partial gestation. The philosophical questions that this opens up around the right to life and abortion are also really, really interesting as well. But no, I don't think that this will lead to a spike in fertility rates. I have no doubt if we could snap our fingers right now and bring this technology into being with, no risks to the fetus, an army of women would be clamoring to use this. I don't believe that those 3 women in the pub were outliers. We've reached a point in society, well, in Western societies, where 2-income families have become the norm. The incredible financial pressure that having both careers and motherhood places on women has made motherhood, I think, more of a strain than it's been in a long, long time. And we know this. I think it's part of the fuel of the incredible disaffection between the sexes in the modern era. I think women are continuing to rail through feminist movements at the indignities of biology that constrain them so much to this all consuming role, or it becomes all consuming for as long as there is another human growing inside you. And it's increasingly incompatible with the way that we see ourselves as free, untethered beings in this very sort of enlightened, modern, affluent society that we've come to find ourselves in. So there's a real mismatch between biology and society here. And the reason, I think that there may be like temporary little spikes as we would see same-sex couples utilizing the technology, for sure. But the biggest reason I think it's almost a non-starter technology is that biotech is really hard. To get that last 10% of actually completing a complex process, figuring out the placenta, figuring out nutrition for the whole of gestation, making sure there's no adverse consequences, strong AI is going to get there way, way, way before artificial wombs do, is my bet. And in that case, we're already in a completely different world there, where we're reproducing digital minds at a rapid rate, where people are able to live fully immersed virtual existences. You could have virtual children live lives in completely different eras of history in these simulated existences. And there's no way that anybody would remain tethered to any form of meat sack existence in that scenario. So yeah, very skeptical that will ever take off.
Thanks. Fascinating answers. Let's go back to the Q&A from the audience. Jeremy has the question, one of the ones that has the most votes for it. He asks about the role of AI in guiding us, or maybe even determining what we should be doing. You pointed out that AI probably wouldn't be stuck with the same limitations as our ape brains. So maybe, Jeremy says, you are suggesting AI will take a major role in global government, if not taking it over completely. Do you foresee problems with democratic consent for that? And how can we know in any case that the AI will serve everyone's interests? It may be very clever, but it may not have a human flourishing for everyone at its own heart.
To start with the second part of that question, how can we know? We can't. I don't think there are any safeguards we can or will build into that. I think it's a dice roll, and we're gonna get something that we can't foresee well in advance. But I think it's basically certain that AI is going to play a greater role in global governance in the future and transform or perhaps supersede democratic nation states as we know them. What form that will take and what form that should take, I'm not even going to pretend to know. I've heard a lot of people sort of suggesting maybe singletons are a good idea, or maybe some kind of human world government is a good idea, human version of a singleton. We know so little, like the people that are working on AI safety and building AI systems still know so little about how they work and what's motivating them and what they what they turn into when they scale. So I think to try and give a concrete answer of like, oh, we'll have a world government or we'll have an AI influenced government and it'll look like this and it will render this obsolete, but this part will be fine. We have no idea. And I think that is, again, another reason to be humbled by the technologies that we're building and to be really profoundly aware of the immensity of this moment in human history, that where we can foresee the general, we can see that it seems obvious that AI systems are going to play more of a role in human decision making, that will leach out into policy making and politics. Perhaps to give you something more concrete, one of the things that I envisage is a kind of symbiotic merger that, in the way that's sort of already happening with auto predict in Gmail and things like that, that not only is it starting to predict your speech, but through that it's starting to shape your thoughts. And in that form alone, in that rudimentary form alone, it is going to influence the decisions we make and the beliefs that we hold. Yeah, the larger scale stuff of how a future government would work, I would love to know more about that. And I hope I live long enough to actually see some of it instantiated, but no idea.
Well, we need to avoid being foolishly overconfident. We need to avoid thinking we know more clearly than is the reality. And that may be uncomfortable, but unless we can gain some comfort with that uncertainty, we're likely to be misled by naive or foolish thoughts. I must jump to a question that I see Valentin Chesnokov has placed. He says, well, we're not hearing much positive, not hearing much optimistic. We've heard there will be no children, no sex. I guess he means no sex with real humans, no jobs, but we will still have a mental health epidemic and lots of challenges that no one is able to solve. Can you say something actually optimistic, please?
Sure, yes. That I think many of the worst indignities of being human, being meat sacks, can and will be overcome. And the thing I'm most optimistic about, or one of the things, is disease, short, compressed lifespans of birth, procreation, and death within 100, 120 years. And within that, the amount of frailty, misunderstanding, loss of faculty, the loss of everyone you've ever known or loved in this finite span of time, the inability, as David and I were saying before this kicked off, to truly explore a topic, a single topic or a single facet of human endeavor to the full, to become an expert in music, to read all the books that you dream of reading, to explore the mysteries of the universe, to understand consciousness or cognition. I think so much of that can and will be overcome. But life extension alone would be such a miraculous intervention, or health span extension, so that if and when we die late and we die well and we die humanely. That would be one of the greatest contributions to the decline of human suffering that has ever been seen. And I think in addition to that, if we're in a strong AI world, I think you've talked about the things, no sex, no this, no that. And I think what we often miss, I'm foregrounding the book, as it were, in these transition times, where I'm actually trying to acknowledge, yeah, these are going to be bumpy times to live through. But if we get through it, the message is that the best of times can ensue. And the best of times won't ensue through us walking around as this four-limbed meat sack, ape-brained creature. They'll ensue in a form that is augmented, that is digital, that is merged with or superseded by AI. And in that future, it's not, loss aversion kicks in because we think about all the things that we don't have. But with different preferences and motivations and desires, It won't be taking away the things that are great about being human. It will be taking the best things about being human: rationality, intelligence, exploration, knowledge, experience, and augmenting them by such a gargantuan amount that something akin to a utopia is truly possible. The trouble with that is it is so much easier to concretely narrativize the stuff we already have that won't be there anymore. And we think about it just as, we'll just be us, but minus the things that we love most. And the message is, no, we won't be us. We'll be something really different. Intelligent life will have evolved to a different stage. And the possibilities are so immense, so impossible to conceptualize, but so wondrous that this is the future that we should be striving to bring into being and enable. And the reason that it's so optimistic is because if this is the make or break century, if we can stave off existential risks long enough to give rise to superintelligence and post-humanity, then intelligent life can go on for trillions of generations, trillions of beings, more intelligent life, more sentience, more joy, more exploration than has ever existed in the span of life on Earth can go on to survive and thrive in a way that humans never could. And I think that's one of the most radiantly optimistic things that I can conceive.
The Transhumanist declaration envisions both tremendously positive futures and tremendously negative futures. And it's a hallmark of transhumanism, as I see it, to be able to keep these different scenarios in mind at the same time and not become unstable or incapable of action as a result. Let's take a more practical question. It's now on the top of the list by Austin Geary, who wants to know if you have any advice on what's the best time to jump into practical transhumanism, such as upgrading one's biology with Neuralink or the like, when there are risks in each of these technologies. And there's always the likelihood of some better versions of the technology coming along later. So there's always an argument not to take particularly early therapy because it might mess us up, but if we wait longer, then there'll be a better therapy later. So how do you assess yourself, if you can say, or how do other people that you know assess whether to take modafinil or other nootropics or other experimentation to enhance ourselves in this transhumanist direction?
So when it comes to nootropics, supplements, things like that, I mean, the community that I'm in Oxford, what I tend to see is that people are quite open to kind of taking whatever, try anything once, if it seems to work well, play around with self-optimization. It's interesting that I think that, I wouldn't go as far as to say consensus, but the murmurings that I hear most are often that the best drug is caffeine, which is a little bit depressing, that we haven't come up with anything substantially better for cognitive enhancement. But yeah, in terms of really invasive future tech stuff, I mean, I've thought through cryonic suspension, certainly machine brain interfaces and uploading and things like that. I think for most invasive interventions, I don't want to be an early adopter. I think it's kind of silly to do that. And I think actually for a life extension intervention that's quite uncertain, so taking something like whether it's resveratrol or metformin, I'm 31 years old, and I kind of think at this stage, if it ain't broke, I'm not going to ingest things that are going to have unpredictable side effects that tinker with a complex system that none of us really understand very well. That said, if I was over 50, I probably would start taking metformin. I think, yeah, the trade-offs are different for everybody and different as you age. And I think maybe like a more interesting scenario is to do with destructive uploading. Like at what stage of life would you destructively upload? I think a lot of people, you know, if you give them the scenario that you're on your deathbed and you can somehow destructively upload with your brain still intact, most people are kind of like, yeah, why not? I'll go for it, as long as I can opt out of the upload existence at some point if I really hate it. But yeah, what if the hypothetical is you live a natural lifespan, or you destructively upload at 40 for a shot at immortality, but you have to do it before you've lived out most of your life, or, you know, make it even more extreme, you destructively upload at 20 before you've had your regular human existence. That's a conundrum I would angst over heavily, but I mean, yeah, I think I lean to, I'd rather live a really long time as a head in the cloud than live a natural human lifespan. And that answer is going to be really different for lots of people. And, you know, cryonic suspension is another one that comes with lots of different complexities and challenges, because there's the difficulty of finding somewhere in your city that can get to you in time to get you on ice as quickly as possible, and, you know, all the rest of it. So really the short and obvious answer is use independent critical thought and analyze every situation as it comes.
Take advantage of community knowledge, find the right communities of people who have done serious research on this and who are happy to share in an unbiased and an open way what they have found. There's time for a few more questions. Again, I'll ask the audience to help me prioritize. There's more questions in the list than we're going to have time to address straight away. So if you see one there that you particularly want to bump up in priority, now's the time to do it. I'm going to take a question from Robert Whitfield, who is asking for, do you evidence, maybe from your historical analysis, you've looked at big trends in history, do you see evidence that humanity is capable of handling the sorts of transitions and challenges which are now coming to us? Or will we be vulnerable to, in a way that we can't reasonably hope to control? So are we capable or incapable of cooperating in such a way that we're going to be able to exercise serious control over these alternative futures?
Oh, I have a simple answer to that, which is no. I mean, yes, we we are capable in the short term sometimes of muddling through. Like, you know, we made it through the 20th century, and that wasn't a guarantee. We had nuclear weapons for half of that century, and that could have gone catastrophically wrong. But we forget that nuclear weapons haven't gone away. Not only do we still have them, but we're compounding the risk with more advanced biotechnology, more advanced AI, and on the horizon, perhaps also nanotechnology. And the idea that we should be optimistic because we sat on, let's say, nukes for 50 years doesn't fill me with confidence, particularly given the astonishing and frightening number of near misses and near catastrophic situations that occurred. And I think, you know, recent history, COVID is a fantastic example of humanity's lack of resilience to even, you know, global shocks that are nowhere near an existential risk scenario. The fact that we didn't have adequate pandemic prevention measures in place in itself rings massive alarm bells about our ability to think decades into the horizon and sustain a focus on these big picture risks. I think Ukraine is also really indicative of the fact that most people seem to have forgotten about the Cold War and nuclear weapons until like 2 months ago. And now it's like, oh, that's a bit bad. Maybe we should worry about that now. If it's not in living memory, and if it hasn't happened within a couple of decades, we kind of dismiss those risks as no longer a worry. And the reality is those risks are compounding very quickly and getting graver all the time. So I have zero confidence that humanity can sit on the technologies that we've got with the brains that we've got and coordinate in a global fashion to even stave off the worst of climate change over the next century or so.
That leads to a question by Gordon Silverman. Given that humans have not been able to achieve this kind of control and the extraordinary outcomes that should be possible, if we humans have not been able to do it, how will a machine make a difference? Will a machine have an intuition or some other special insight that we humans are currently lacking that will help us to steer a path through these challenges in this make or break century?
The difference between us and them will be intelligence, and they will have it on a scale that we struggle to fathom at present. And human history is a good example of this, that as we've augmented human collective intelligence purely by having a population explosion, breaking out of the Malthusian trap with the Industrial Revolution and bringing more and more brains and agglomerating them in cities, then we've built more complex forms of social organization, more complex hierarchies and divisions of labor that have allowed us to build more powerful technologies and do ever more powerful things to wield more influence over the biosphere and harness dense energy flows. So add more intelligence into the mix and scale that up by orders of magnitude. You're going to, again, be harnessing incredibly dense energy flows incredibly efficiently. You're going to be creating phenomenal amounts of wealth because you're going to be able to create goods and services with very little labor very cheaply. And the potential that that unlocks, the pace of innovation that that unlocks, and the ability, if you just think about the ability of AIs to mine enormous data sets and to find patterns and to unlock new sources of knowledge and discovery, to generate new materials and material science to build things in entirely different ways. It's the difference between everything. And intelligence has such an adaptive value in evolution in the environment that we find ourselves in that may not hold in perpetuity, but it's hard to see that changing anytime soon.
Thanks. A question by Eugene Diana in terms of regulations of this technologies or limitations put on possible transhumanist aspirations. Do you advocate regulations? Do you advocate limits? Or are you in favor of let's work this out together, anything goes?
Are we talking about a specific technology here, or?
No, he hasn't mentioned any particular technology, but I mean, are there technologies you believe should be limited? I guess nuclear weapons is already one such technology, but what about AI, for example? Is it appropriate to encourage companies by legislation to put a higher priority on safety than on rushing to be the first to market?
Yeah, I think so. And I think trying to even symbolically cultivate norms around what we hope AI will do for humanity and what uses of it are considered nefarious. It's very difficult to do it. It's very difficult to coordinate, but I do believe that those gestures are important. When it comes to how specifically we might or should regulate a technology like AI, I have to default to epistemic humility there and say, I have not thought through layer by layer the policy well enough to have a good answer to that. And from what I've heard from people who do have more concrete ideas there, the suggestions are wildly divergent, which gives me a really low confidence that there is like a robust expert opinion there. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that there, but it's something that like everything to do with an AI saturated world, I will continue to mull over.
Well, Eugene has mentioned a few other technologies that might be candidates for regulation. Human cloning, germline editing, embryonic stem cell technologies, which already is heavily regulated.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the biotech stuff is fascinating. I think the regulation of embryonic stem cells was a huge mistake. And biotech's a more obvious case where you can't keep the genie in the bottle, and you won't. And the potential gains to humanity are so enormous, particularly in the life extension, health span extension space. When it comes to human cloning, like reproductive cloning, I don't see any good reason why not. It would be one of the most fascinating things for us to witness. It's obviously something that we have the capabilities to do. It may be unsettling, but yeah, obviously that raises issues of the rights of clones. But again, I think like that's all fairly obvious stuff. Like, they diverge into an autonomous separate being from the minute that the life experiences of those people diverge. And I'd kind of like to live in a world where we do clone humans. Biotechnology in general, I would advocate for a light touch. And I think the stuff that's concerning is the stuff around bioweapons and bioengineered pathogens. But we've already seen again historically that norms around biotechnology have not been robust. So the gene sequences of viruses that were never meant to be made available online have been made available online. Horsepox virus has been synthesized from those online materials. And, unlike with nuclear weapons, this is really difficult to regulate because you can do a lot in the biotech space with minimal money and minimal expertise, like PhD level training. So yeah, it's a really tough one. Specific policy prescriptions, again, I don't have.
Well, the last question in the main sequence, as it were, will be the reverse question. Not so much what technology should we be restricting or legislating about, but PNJ asks what technologies, current technologies, or ones that could become current soon, are most in need of improvement to support us in this evolution, or possible evolution to a future superhuman. Which ones would you like to see more investment in, more resources applied, and faster progress?
Perhaps ironically, I think the answer there is nuclear power, or one of the answers. And obviously ironically, because nuclear weapons pose a serious existential risk to civilization. But so does anthropogenic global warming. And what's clear is that we cannot rely on renewables to scale fast enough to see us through, again, this transition phase. We are burning more coal every year, and the energy needs of human civilization are growing every year. We have nuclear reactors across many Western developed countries that are being decommissioned and shut down, or certainly were until very recently. And yeah, it's clear to me that what should have happened is that many decades ago, we should have made an enormous investment in nuclear energy, and that doing so would have led us to a point today where we could scale up that technology. It's already much safer than it used to be. And nuclear reactor design has improved significantly over the decades, but that was under conditions of extreme political hostility and limitation in R&D. And so, yeah, that was a key technology for civilization that we needed to invest in heavily in the past, but we still have the chance to do it today, and we need to do it pronto.
In a moment, Elise, I'll give you a chance to draw some thoughts together, because we've been all over many topics. As you pointed out at the beginning, there's a lot of connections between these topics, so that's entirely appropriate. But if there are some points maybe that deserve to be brought back into focus, let's do that in a minute. But first, I'd like to briefly talk about what's coming next in London Futurists and related activities. This has been our event today. If people are interested in, well, what else do transhumanists talk about? There is a transhumanist discussion taking place tomorrow online. It's by the US Transhumanist Party on one set of transhumanist ideas, which is sometimes called the death of death, sometimes also called super longevity. And there is 3 people taking part in a panel discussion: Jose Cordero, who is the Vice Chair of Humanity Plus, Terry Grossman, who is a medical doctor who has written a lot about the steps to take so we can live long enough to live forever, as in the subtitles of one of the books he co-authored with Ray Kurzweil. And then there's Simon Vaslander, who works at Artificial General Intelligence Corporation, and he has lots of practical ideas. He may come back to this notion of caffeine as perhaps being the best practical method for enhancing our health in the short term. So there is that discussion taking place tomorrow. It's broadcast live on the YouTube channel used by the US Transhumanist Party. You can find that easily enough online. That's from 9 p.m. UK time. If you would prefer to hear more academic, credentialed discussion of some of the same topics, I will point you to a webinar that's taking place on Tuesday from 4 to 7 UK time, organized by Rejuveron. This is the third time they are doing such a conference. The headline is Age Better, Live Longer, and Accelerating Innovation in Longevity Research. And they have, as you can see there, a number of speakers, some of whom are quite controversial within the longevity community. They have written that the hallmarks of aging, for example, are not enough by themselves, and we need a better understanding if we are truly going to make progress in longevity research. So 3 panels there: bold ambitions, how to find investors, and make therapies happen. And that's just time to mention one more event taking place, which is London Futurists meeting a week today on the subject of coexisting with AI, in the sense of how do we build aligned AI, by somebody who used to be at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford for many years, somebody who also, as it happens, has Australian connections in his background, Stuart Armstrong. He has recently co-created aligned AI, and he has some very interesting ideas as to how we can look forward to a very positive future coexisting with AI, provided we work hard at this question of alignment. So keep your eye out for more news on that event and others in the usual London Futurist channels. That takes us back to today's event. Elise, you have done a wonderful job at covering a great deal of ground in a very clear, compelling, engaging, and, dare I say it, a human manner. What would you like to leave in the minds of the viewers?
Oh, okay. Well, I hate to be cliched, but I do think that this is the century in which we're likely to see some of the best and the worst things that human beings have ever borne witness to. And there's something about that that tickles me. I truly hope this is the best century that overall humans ever get to witness. But either way, these are some of the most interesting, mind-bending times, and it is an incredible privilege to be able to see life in such a state of complexity, life on the precipice of something of such enormous potential. I know that doesn't always give us so much consolation as individuals if some of that potential leads to places that are uncertain and hard to grapple with, and maybe even terrifying. But while I don't think the future is entirely in our hands, we do have an opportunity to try and nudge things in better directions. And I think that's the call to action and the place where we can derive the most consolation. A, from merely trying to understand the world as best we can and the vast scope of possibilities that lie before us. But B, from that understanding, then to recognize, okay, there are better and worse outcomes, and we're going to do everything in our power to try and nudge things in a positive direction. So I hope there's some optimism left over. But for details, for nitty gritty, I would say read the book. And hopefully there'll be many more chats to come about all the big mysteries of life, the universe, and everything.
I echo that recommendation. This is a book that really deserves to be read. I found myself nodding along happily, smiling on many occasions. Occasionally I thought, oh, that's not sure I believe that, but then in most cases I had my mind changed by the time I reached the end of a chapter. There are still open questions, of course, as Elise has pointed out, and indeed I look forward to seeing a lot more of Elise's work published and her involvement in more discussions. Thank you again, Elise.
Thanks, guys. Bye.